Welcome.
Welcome to the Everything Podcast, and this episode I'm going to be recapping the 12th of January 2025 episode of the Big Finish Podcast, which, as you can guess, was released on the 12th of January 2025. I am recording this episode on the 9th of March 2025, so without further ado, this is my recap of the 12th of January 2025 episode of the Big Finish Podcast. We start off with a brief clip from Zygon Sentry Infiltration. Then Nick and Benji introduce this episode of the Big Finish Podcast. Nick and Benji outline what this episode of the Big Finish Podcast will include, which you actually heard if you checked out yesterday's episode. It was in the trailer. Nick and Benji mention Benji being ill. Nick and Benji discuss the weather. Nikki mentions snow and air conditioning. Benji mentions lack of light. Benji doesn't like consistent snow, as well as his relationship with snow when he was younger. Nick and Benji discuss the temperature. Nick mentions his cat. Nick details what he believes his cat is thinking. Nick apologises. Benji introduces the good review guy. The trailer from Rani Takes on the World Beyond Bannerman Road could be heard. Multiple reviews from Rani Takes on the World Beyond Bannerman Road are read out. Nick mentions Emily Cook. Nick reveals that Emily no longer works for Big Finish. Nick mentions an encounter with Emily. Nick mentions his relationship with Elizabeth Sladen and her daughter Sadie Miller, who now plays Sarah Jane. They both play Sarah Jane, Elizabeth Sladen when it was first on, and now Sadie Miller in the Big Finish world. Nick reveals that next episode's good review guy will focus on Torchwood launch date. Nick introduces some behind the scenes from Zygon Sentry Infiltration. These behind the scenes from Zygon Sentry Infiltration can be heard. Within these behind the scenes, the origins of Zygon Sentry are unveiled. No, I was right the first time. Nick introduces listeners' emails. Benji unveils the podcast email address. That's the Big Finish Podcast email address. Benji reads out the first email, which is centered around Christmas. Nick reads out the second email, which focuses on Davros. Benji reads out the third and final email, which is centered around Dracula and the Time War, as well as the War Games in colour. Nick mentions Matt Fitton. Benji and Nick introduce the behind the scenes for Torchwood Yanto's Inferno. Behind the scenes for Torchwood Yanto's Inferno can be heard. These behind the scenes contain multiple clips from Torchwood Yanto's Inferno. Nick introduces the random on Selectatron. Benji explains how the random on Selectatron works. Benji reveals this episode's chosen release. Nick mentions Lisa Greenwood. The trailer for this chosen release can be heard. Benji explains how to get the 25% discount on this release. Nick reveals what the next episode of the Big Finish Podcast will include. And this episode of the Big Finish Podcast finishes with the first 15 minutes of Zygon Sentry Infiltration, The Unknowing Mirror. And that is my recap of the 12th of January 2025 episode of the Big Finish Podcast. In tomorrow's episode, I'm going to be recapping Anti-Dexter with Season 4, Episode 3, which there is no trailer for, but don't worry, because in tomorrow's episode, the trailers will return. It's just because there's no trailer, obviously. But back to this episode now. Let me know what you thought of the 12th of January 2025 episode of the Big Finish Podcast. If you listened to it, my recap. If you didn't, you can put your thoughts on both of those in the comments below, as well as anything else you want to go on the channel, such as any previews or recaps. Put those in the comments below as well. Remember to also like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow for my recap of Anti-Dexter. Let's win Season 4, Episode 3. Goodbye.